Hey Bowtie Nation, Joseph Hogue here with the easiest and safest way to get your dividends through a dividend ETF. But there are so many ETFs out there that they can all look kind of the same. So I'm going to rank the top 5 dividend ETFs from worst to best, show you the differences in each, and how to make sure which is right for you. Stick around and I'll also reveal a hidden danger in some of these that is going to cost you thousands more in taxes. First up, we see the popular Global X NASDAQ 100 Covered Call ETF, the QYLD. And while this is the lowest on our list, it doesn't mean that's the worst dividend ETF out there, just my least favorite of the 5. I'm going to cover the pros and cons of each ETF, and there are a lot of downsides here, but this fund can serve a purpose for a very specific type of investor. The fund holds stocks in the NASDAQ 100 index, a tech-heavy group of stocks, but also with some decidedly non-tech companies like Costco, Pepsi, and T-Mobile. It's just the largest companies that have decided to list on the NASDAQ. And here you see how the fund is able to pay that high 11.6% dividend. Holding those stocks, each month it sells call options against part of the portfolio. Now, selling a call option gives another investor the right to buy that amount of stocks at a certain price, but the seller, the ETF here, is going to collect a cash premium, which it uses to pay out those dividends. Here we see the fund has sold a call option expiring March 15th on about $215 million in shares. So even if the stocks in the fund fall, the ETF can still pay out those dividends from the money it collects each month selling that call option. One of the problems, though, is something we've seen lately with the NASDAQ surging 35% in the past year and 5% just since January. Because the fund is selling that right to another investor to buy the shares at a set price to collect that cash, it misses out on some of that upside as well. We see here that the NASDAQ up 35% in the last 12 months. The QYLD fund is up less than 9% in that time. The upside here is in times when the NASDAQ is falling, that QYLD shouldn't fall by quite as much, and you're still going to get that dividend. So part of the decision here is which you prefer, a higher upside potential or some downside protection and the dividend. Of course, one of the big selling points for the QYLD is that monthly dividend payment. For most stocks paying every 3 months, waiting on those dividends is excruciating, but you always know that your cash is less than a month away with this one. But it's in the stats here why we see I've ranked the QYLD the last in our list of 5 dividend ETFs. While it does offer the highest dividend yield, it produced the lowest total return over the last 3 years. Now that's the price return plus the dividend return, and you see that 3% annual total return, the price has fallen so much that it's wiped out much of the dividend yield. It also charges the highest expense fee of the group. At 0.6%, you're going to pay $6 for every $1,000 invested, which might not seem like much, but it is more than 10 times the fee on our lowest fee ETF next. For all its downsides, the QYLD can be a good investment for someone living off their dividends and not really worried about that price destruction. Even if this sounds like you, though, check out those other ETFs because my favorite is going to give you the best of both worlds. We're just getting started on our ranking of dividend ETFs, but understand that my top picks might not be yours. It just depends on what's more important to you when it comes to dividends. For example, if you don't care about that total return and just want the highest cash flow possible, then maybe the QYLD would be higher up on your list. For this list, I tried striking a balance then between yield and total return, so collecting a high dividend as possible, but also getting some price return on my shares. I also ranked the ETFs on dividend consistency and growth, so receiving the same amount or more per share for each dividend payment. Again, that high yield on the QYLD is nice, but the dividend has been as high as 50 cents a share and as low as 16 cents each, making it really difficult to plan your cash flow. Now, because these are all funds of dividend stocks, none of them are going to pay an absolutely consistent dividend. They distribute just whatever is paid out by the stocks. That's going to fluctuate, but for the best on the list, the stocks tend to be dividend growers and more stable. And of course, you always want to pay attention to those fees charged on an ETF. Holding shares of the QYLD is going to cost you that $6 for every $1,000 invested, which again might not sound like much, but it's more than 10 times the cost on our 2 Vanguard funds that I'll reveal later. But this is just my ranking though, so let me know what's most important to you in dividend stocks in the comments below. If you're younger and want faster growth, then maybe you go for that lower yield and the higher return. If though you're older and need that cash flow, maybe it's all about yield, so let me know below. The Schwab US Dividend Equity ETF, ticker SCHD, has always been one of my favorites, but kind of got edged out of this list. I will say that this one is infinitely less complicated than the QYLD, just holding shares of 100 stocks of quality, cash-flowing companies like Broadcom, AbbVie, Chevron, and Coca-Cola. And while the fund only pays a 3.5% dividend yield, and you have to wait 3 months for each quarterly payment, the share price has grown consistently to produce that 8% total annual return. This is one of the least expensive in our list. So this one is pretty plain vanilla, the oatmeal of the dividend ETF world. It's not too exciting, but it is good for you with the dividend cash flow and price return. Another upside of the SCHD, though, is it pays qualified dividends, a major benefit I'm going to talk about later that is going to save you thousands on taxes. Now, the 3.5% dividend yield isn't going to make you rich, and it's going to be difficult to live off, but it's higher than a lot of the other funds. Overall, though, definitely one you want to consider. Now, any of these dividend ETFs can be a good investment, but any stock or even ETF is going to have that risk of losing money. That's why I also keep some money in a no-penalty CD at CIT Bank. These pay 4.9%, so a little lower than T-bills, but you have that instant access to your money without the regular penalties you get from most CDs. You earn interest daily with no opening or maintenance fees, and it's all FDIC insured. It is a great way to invest your emergency fund or just spare cash for those super safe returns. So look for the link I'm going to leave in the description or just snap a shot of the QR code here. The Vanguard Dividend Appreciation Index Fund, ticker VIG, pays the lowest dividend yield of the group, but has managed to produce nearly the highest total return. The fund invests in large U.S. companies with a history of growing their dividend payments. In fact, the median market size of stocks in this ETF is $196 billion. So we're talking mega cap companies like Microsoft, Apple, and JP Morgan. One of the downsides of the funds is that it does focus so much on growth that I think dividends are an afterthought here. Yeah, Apple has grown its dividend by 25% in the last 5 years, but it's still only a 0.5% dividend yield. Hell, you can do a 100% increase on a penny, but it's still not much cash flow. So while these are all dividend growers and solid companies, that 1.8% dividend on the fund barely qualifies as a dividend in my book. And these low-yield dividends are like getting a participation trophy. You're in the game, but that's about it. But then for someone looking for a little more price return than cash flow, you're going to find it in that VIG. This one was edged out on total return by just one other fund, and only by 0.01%. With Vanguard, you always know you're going to pay almost nothing in fees here, with 0.08% on the Dividend Appreciation ETF. So overall, it's a good fund if you're not interested in those dividends, but then why would you be watching an ETF video? I like the fund, but it's not a competitive dividend, and I can get similar returns in others on the list. We're coming up on the 2 best dividend ETFs, but I've got to send that special shout out to all you out there in the nation. Thank you for spending a part of your day to be here. If you're not part of that community yet, just click that little red subscribe button. It's free and you'll never miss an episode. Now, fixing some of that problem in the VIG is the Vanguard High Dividend Yield, the ticker VYM, with its 3.1% dividend. This one also invests in those very large U.S. companies, holding shares of 450 stocks with a median market cap of $132 billion. But here, the emphasis is on that higher yield, so there isn't as much tech. You've still got Broadcom, but it's mostly the older dividend payers like JP Morgan, Exxon, Johnson & Johnson, Home Depot, and Merck. Of course, you're still not setting the world on fire with that dividend, but it's nearly double the yield on the VIG, and you get a similar total return. 3% is really my cutoff for what I consider a true dividend stock or fund, so this one would be one to put on the list. We've still got that best dividend ETF to highlight, one with a perfect balance of high yield and total return, but you need to watch out for one trap that catches every dividend investor from time to time. You see, folks, not all dividends are created equal for taxes, and it can cost you thousands of dollars. In fact, the highest yielding dividend ETFs in this list are going to be taxed at higher rates, meaning Uncle Sam is going to take a bigger chunk of your dividends. In the United States, dividends are taxed in one of 2 ways, either as ordinary dividends or qualified dividends. Now, while qualified dividends are taxed at either 0, 15, or 20% depending on your income, any amount you collect in ordinary dividends, that's going to be added to your regular income and taxed at your income tax rates. You can see what a difference this makes in the rates here. Let's say you make $150,000 a year and collect $10,000 in dividends. Not knowing the difference between qualified and ordinary dividends is going to cost you more than $1,300 in taxes. For a dividend stock or a dividend to be qualified and get that lower tax rate, you have to hold the stock for more than 60 days around the ex-dividend date. So on that day when it's decided that you get that dividend, you need to have held the stock for a total of 60 days, whether it's 60 days before, after, or 60 days around that date. I know it can be confusing at first, but this is going to save you thousands of dollars in taxes to understand this, so watch through that part again if you need to. Importantly here though, some of those income strategies and dividend ETFs don't qualify for that lower tax rate no matter how long you hold them. Any dividend ETF selling options to create that dividend income like the QYLD does, all that dividend is going to be taxed at the higher income rates. And think about it this way, that 11.6% dividend on the QYLD looks great, but if you're in the 33% income tax bracket, then It's really only a 9.5% yield because you're paying that higher tax rate rather than the 15% you could be paying on qualified dividends. So then understanding if your dividend stock or an ETF pays a qualified dividend is going to take a little research, but do it before you buy. Many real estate investment trusts or REITs, master limited partnerships or MLPs, and these income ETFs do not qualify, so always double check on the ETF's website. Of the 5 ETFs ranked here, only the Schwab and the 2 Vanguard ETFs pay those qualified dividends. Now you still might want to hold some of those higher yields on the other 2, but understand you're probably not getting as high a yield as you think. Putting the JP Morgan Equity Premium Income ETF, the JEPI, top on my list probably won't surprise any of you in the Bowtie Nation. I've highlighted the fund before, and I like it for that balance between yield and return. The fund invests in defensive, large-cap stocks like insurers, consumer staples, and pharmaceuticals. You see here, it's all those bellwether stocks like AbbVie, Coca-Cola, and United Health. And that's going to give it safety when the market tumbles. Then the portfolio managers sell those call options on the S&P 500, that broad stock market index, to generate that cash flow to pay for the dividends. That does make it a similar strategy used by the QYLD. Here you see it has $55 million position against the portfolio in those sold call options and other instruments to produce that 8% dividend. So for those of you living off your dividends, this one can provide that high yield without the price loss that you get with the QYLD. You get the 8% dividend cash flow and just a little extra price return for that 8.5% total return over the last 3 years. The expense fee is higher than the Vanguard and the Schwab funds, but still nearly half that of the QYLD. Now, some of the downsides to the JEPI are that it's not a monthly dividend with just 8 distributions last year and no real consistency in the payout. Like that covered call ETF, it's just whatever the portfolio managers can pay out from that call option strategy. And again, these are also not qualified dividends, so the money you collect is going to be added to your income and then taxed at those rates. Overall, though, if we're talking about dividend ETFs, this one has something for everyone. Get that safe 4.9% yield on a no-penalty CD from CIT Bank with the link in the description, perfect for an emergency fund or your extra cash. Or click on the video to the right for the one index fund every investor needs. Don't forget to join the Let's Talk Money community by tapping that subscribe button and clicking the bell notification.